We now come to our final speaker before the break. We will now hear from James Wilcox, who journeyed to the tip of the Horn of Africa. He addresses the key question that perhaps brought some of you here, which is, why do we choose to go on adventures? Why do we choose to go on journeys to discover new parts of the world and spend time with different people? James Wilcox and his journey to Puntland and to the lighthouse on the tip of the Horn of Africa.
Thank you. Yeah, why indeed? We've heard from the speakers today, they've been inspired by talks at the RGS or more worthy ideals of microfinance. My trip to Somalia was inspired by a story I heard 15 years ago. I worked with an ex-merchant Navy seaman, and we talked during our lunch breaks about travel, about things we'd done. And one of the stories he told me was about a lighthouse on the very tip of the Horn of Africa. The story he told me was that it was the worst posting in the British Empire, that 3 men would be stationed there for 2 years at a time. They would be have supplies sent to them every 6 months, and they would be cut off from the rest of Africa by vast swamps, violent tribes, and towering cliffs. He also told me that when they sailed past the island of Socotra, they'd always sailed downwind, because if they sank, they'd only drown rather than be washed ashore and eaten by cannibals. So I took his stories with a pinch of salt. This was the day before smartphones and Google searches, so I couldn't call him out on his stories. But as time went on, I remembered this story about the lighthouse, and my work took me to organising things in Mogadishu and other parts of Somalia. And I spoke to some people, 3 guys who were also interested in Somalia, and told them about this story. And they agreed that we should go. We should go in search of what I later discovered was an Italian colonial lighthouse on the tip of the Horn of Africa. So in January, we embarked on this trip. The area of Somalia that we travelled to was Puntland here. Now, the country of Somalia is quite fragmented at the moment. The part that used to be British Somalia is now Somaliland. It's not internationally recognised, but it has its own government, has its own currency, even has its own embassy in London. It's not in this palatial area of Kensington. It's actually above a garage in Bethnal Green. But this is true. If you're interested in knowing more about Somaliland, I suggest you go down there. He's a very interesting chap. The area where we were travelling, I'll talk about in just a sec, is in Puntland, and then the southern part of Somalia is still quite a big mess, governed by Mogadishu with the African Union forces. Al-Shabaab still occupy a major area, but that would be another story. In fact, this is a photo I took in 2012 in Mogadishu of the cockpit of a Belarus airline. And this isn't in the airport. This was by the side of a street in a residential area. But we go back to Puntland, and the original plan was that we would fly to the capital, to Garowe, drive up to Bosaso on the coast, and take a boat across the Bereda, and then finally to the very tip of the Horn of Africa. The reason we would take the boat across the top was partly because in November of last year, Hurricane Meg came through the area and destroyed a lot of the roads in the area. And secondly, for security reasons, we wanted to get into the tip of the Horn of Africa and back out again as quickly as possible. Now, before we flew, the plan was to fly to Garowe. Now, 48 hours before we arrived, we were told that the airport was being renovated and we would be landing in Cardo. And then 24 hours before we arrived, we were told by the guys picking us up that we'd be arriving in Bosaso, which is great. I mean, we're trying to get there and we're already 2/3 of the way and we've not even landed. But just before we boarded the flight, we were told that the flight was going to Cardo, and I was a bit concerned about this because we'd been arranged to be collected here. So I spoke to the representative of the airline, and he said, "It doesn't matter, just get on the plane." I said, "Look, we've got people picking us up." So he said, "Come over here." He says, "It's going to Bosaso, but it's a secret." And it's the only plane I've caught where I really had no idea where we were going to land. But it soon became apparent because when we arrived, there were at the airport there was lots of media there. There were the Chinese construction workers with big banners, and it turned out it was the following day was the inauguration of the new airport in Bosaso, and in fact we were the first plane. Our plane was the first plane to land there, and all of the all of the local media came to interview us. And about 2 minutes after this photo was taken, a UN plane arrived with the Italian ambassador and the British ambassador, and they quite quickly realised that we were people of no importance, and moved straight on to the other people. Now. The town of Bosaso is not particularly historical, not particularly interesting, but it does have a good example of what Somali shops look like. Because of a lack of infrastructure, a lack of sort of printing, and because a great deal of the population are illiterate, a lot of the shops just have paintings of what they're selling. So this would be a coffee shop. A mobile phone shop would have pictures of mobile phones on the side, and then you get other services and goods, such as this shop, which performs medical treatments and medical services. The other thing you can get in Bosaso, which is the first time I've had it, because the rest of Somalia used to be an Italian colony, so it's the only place I've had a really good cup of Italian coffee served in a British half-pint mug. But as I said, we're in Bosaso, so the plan was to take a boat across to Bureda along this coastline. Now, most people's idea of Somalia is it's a desert, it's a flat area. But in fact, along the coastline, the huge cliffs come out of the sea. At one point, the cliffs go up 1 kilometre straight out of the sea, and the mountains just behind it go up to 2,000 metres in altitude. And it's on these mountains that Puntland's most famous crop is grown, and they grow frankincense. And when you look at old Roman documentation, ancient Greek documentation, even the ancient Ethiopian documentation, they talk about the land of Punt. Land of Punt was a great trading nation, and frankincense has been grown and shipped here for millennia. Now, the idea of getting the boat was a good one, but unfortunately, when we were about 2/3 of the way through, a bit of a storm hit, and we had to land the boat. And it was an amazing introduction into village life in this very remote part of Somalia. The small villages here have much more in common with Yemen and Oman, where they do a huge amount of trading, both legal and illegal trading. And in fact, the recent conflict in Yemen has hit them very hard because that's their main trading partners. But before we'd even offloaded our boat, a compound had been found for us, a goat had been killed, and we were given, because they were an Italian colony, we were given spaghetti and boiled goat for lunch, which was really fantastic. Now, at this point, we were met by the governor of the province, and the governor is Abdul Qadir, and it was interesting to meet him because you imagine maybe a governor of a province of Somalia, you have some idea of what he might be like. But Abdul Qadir is a mental health care assistant from Kilburn who's taken a 2-year sabbatical to, as he says, just try and help Somalia. The province that he's the governor of is a newly appointed one. And it's a tough job. He earns $79 a month during his sabbatical. His staff, he has a monthly budget of $1,700, and anything that he wants to implement, any roads, any schools, any electricity, any projects, he has to raise taxes. And this is in an area where no one's paid taxes for 25 years. So it's a tough job, but he was a wonderful man and a wonderful host. We decided to travel with Abdul Qadir overland for the rest of the journey to the lighthouse, and it was just a wonderful insight into life in this rural coastline area of Somalia. This is the view from Abdul Qadir's office. I mean, there's no electricity, but as he says, it's a much nicer view waking up and looking out the window here than at Kilburn High Road. And we have another Italian lighthouse here and a small Italian colonial chapel. We passed small fishing villages like this one at Harbo, and really just experience life in these very remote areas. Here the guys are playing dominoes, and the guys that lose, they smear ash on their faces as a kind of forfeit. And one of the most remarkable things is the seafood. Almost none of the Somalis that we met like eating lobster. So it's very easy to buy 6-8 lobsters for about $5. And so most of the evenings, I think I ate more lobster in 6 days on this trip than I have done in my entire life. And again, it's wonderful being part of an Italian colonial legacy. I mean, if this part of Somalia had been British, I don't know exactly how they would have cooked the lobster, but I'm sure it wouldn't have been anywhere near as nice. But finally, we did make it to the tip of the Horn of Africa. This is a view looking out into with the Red Sea on the left side and looking straight out. And this is the first part of Africa that gets the sun each day. This is looking back down the coast with the Indian Ocean here. And yes, indeed, we did finally find the lighthouse at the tip of the Horn of Africa. And although the British did occupy this area during the Second World War, it's clear that this wasn't the worst posting in the British Empire. You know, the story, it was an old seaman's tale. But we did find the lighthouse was something else quite interesting, because the design of the lighthouse is quite special. I mean, does anyone have any idea what this symbol is? It's ancient Roman, yeah, it's the fascia. It's the ancient Roman symbol of justice. It's birch twigs, symbolizing corporal punishment, and the axe symbolizing capital punishment. And if we were traveling around in the 1930s, we would be very familiar with this, because this was also the symbol of Italian fascism, much as the swastika was the symbol of German fascism. So on the tip of the Horn of Africa, in one of the most remote parts of Somalia, we found ourselves looking at the world's largest remaining Italian fascist statue, which is not what you would always expect. And so a story, the reason for travel, the reason that we're inspired to go to a place, it's just the start, it's just the tipping point, it's just the push. But there's many other things that we go. And I'll leave you with one more thing. After we'd visited the statue, we went back to the village. And at this shop, we bought some Yemenis dates and Bangladeshi fruit drinks. And instead of paying money, we were just given a phone number. Because in Somalia, the largest note is a 1,000 shilling note. And there's 20,000 shillings to the dollar. So using physical cash doesn't make any sense. But in recent years, they have a very good telecommunication system. So people pay for things by just transferring balance from their phone to another person's phone. And so on the Horn of Africa, in one of the most remote parts, one of the least developed countries in the world, we found ourselves coming up to probably the most advanced, certainly the most used cashless economy in the world. And that's why we travel, not necessarily for reaching the destination, but for the interesting things, the small things, the minutiae we find on the way. Thank you very much.